1960s that will show a majority of African Americans in the Hilltop. It's not there. In people's psyche about African Americans, it's like if there's 2 black people, there's 8 people, there's this group, right? And it's really fascinating because this interviewee, who was African American, was not trying to downplay the role of African Americans in shaping the Hilltop. He's quite proud of those achievements. Historically racialized particular communities in the city. Okay? In our oral history, what we've attempted to do is capture a broad overview of the Hilltop's history from longtime residents. Some of the best so far has been on everyday life. This is particularly true for participants that remember the 1960s and 1970s as an era of particular growth that supported many black businesses and organizations. In these moments, family-owned businesses, ice cream stores, radio stations, and other aspects of that period. Policing around here, the way that they set up certain things around here is based on this information, right? And so there are these conflicting ideas about what the period represented and what the role of policing was. And I think it's interesting because this is mirrored larger even in the Democratic primaries about what is the legacy of this period and specific legislative acts that targeted black communities. And so the other thorny issue that has occasionally come up is the more recent problem of gentrification. In recent years, the Hilltop has rapidly gentrified and become many commercial and real estate developments that have spurred new interest in the neighborhood. Inevitably, this has also meant that older residents have been displaced in the process. Depending on perspective, this has either been a welcoming boon to the community or another one of a long line of events that has destabilized the traditional community in the Hilltop. One interviewee who was worried about some of the changes but is generally optimistic that it has changed considerably or tremendously, and it's changing more. I think I bought my house for $25,000. He's seen these huge shifts. Another interviewee, a longtime white resident of the Hilltop, who's participated in a wide range of community and cultural activities in the neighborhood, noted the following about his moving in. People talk about gentrification as almost kind of an evil word, but I used to say, well, it's either gentrification or putrefaction, because these places were falling apart. Later in the same interview, he says, there was concern There are so many factions that vie for Hilltop. The city owns Hilltop. The construction people, the contractors and developers own Hilltop. The churches own Hilltop. The city has very little. They have no real control over what happens around here. So to say it's gotten better compared to what, okay? And this is a common sentiment, this idea of lost in this process, and does anybody truly care about what happens to long-term residents in the neighborhood? And so going forward, I actually should note, this interviewee in particular, it's really fascinating, because born and raised on the Hilltop, spent a few years away from Washington, came back, and he's noted that most of the people he grew up with on the Hilltop, very few of them still live in the Hilltop. They either live in other parts of Tacoma or on the outskirts of the city, but they still spend tons of time on the Hilltop, right? Because that's where they're from. And so they still maintain these active ties, even though they've been priced out of the neighborhood. And so going forward, what we're trying to do are these broad histories of the Hilltop neighborhood. There are a mixture of community histories that date back to the post-World War II, also addressing some of the more contentious issues that residents on the Hilltop continue to grapple with. So the second case study that I wanted to talk about that Lauren mentioned briefly is the Northwest Detention Center. So the Northwest Detention Center is a detention to interview lawyers who work on NWDC cases, activists that work to advocate on behalf of detainees, and some rare cases, former detainees of the facility. And so this combination of perspectives has yielded important insights in regards to the workings of our immigration system and the many people working to make it a more humane system. So many of these sessions have focused on activists. Some of them are undocumented themselves, and they frequently advocate on behalf of detainees. Know that we're here, and there's people that care too, because they're told every day nobody cares. The way they're treated by ICE and GEO makes them feel that nobody cares. And for those of you who have been to some of these protests, and in fact this was, I think, recorded right outside of one of them, one of the things that they'll do is they'll make music that's loud enough so that detainees can actually hear what's being played outside, right? And so the conditions inside the facility have often been called into question. Issues ranging from inadequate medical care to spoiled food to unpaid labor on frequent attention during the facility's recent history. In reaction to these issues, detainees in the facility have started hunger strikes on several occasions, drawing national attention. One of my former students, Amanda Diaz, with ICE. That's something that we can't deal with. And when you take it up with ICE, they tell you, well, you have to deal with the GEO group because you're under their custody at the time. So they play that back and forth, and they do it so that you just give up, and a lot of people do. Okay? And so, again, it's these sorts of stories that are being captured. And for this particular detainee, who was eventually released, grassroots organizations such as play a critical role in drawing attention to their cases and helping secure necessary resources. In concert with legal organizations, the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, these activists and legal representatives play critical roles in helping detainees and families navigate a system that is complicated and costly by design. In many ways, the Northwest Detention Center is a firm reminder of the role that race and displacement have played into to an older model of displacement and racial antipathy that is played out in Tacoma and in the United States more broadly. Interestingly, when you visit La Resistencia's website and you go to their FAQ, you have a question on what is the history of the NWDC, and they answer it in the following way. I won't read the whole thing, but you'll get a sense of it. But they start by saying, Washington has a long history of violence against immigrants, tracing back to the 1885 Tacoma method of burning down the homes of Chinese railroad workers and expelling them from the Washington territory on the railroad. And they keep going through and mention Japanese internment and the sort of longer legacy of immigrant displacement and so on. And so this is not an uncommon framing. Other observers have also noted the echoes in the original displacement of the Puyallup and other indigenous nations of Western Washington. And indeed, the objective of this broader project is to underscore some of the historical incidents in which race and displacement have played central roles in shaping Tacoma's history. In so doing, we hope to show that incidents, while unique, are also often tied to one another as part of a broader history. With that in mind, there are much more to these stories than histories of oppression. In each historical case study that we're looking at, everyday people also come together to contest displacement in a wide variety of powerful ways. Whether echoed in the work of the Hilltop Action Coalition or of La Resistencia, these are also histories of community agency and organizing power. These are the stories we're aiming to capture in some small way in this project. So thank you, and I look forward to it.
To teach for 1 year at the University of Puget Sound, and then I went to Stanford for a year, and then I came back teaching at the University of Washington in Tacoma, and helped to start that campus. We had 12 faculty and 143 students in 1990. Now we've got, I don't know, hundreds of faculty and 5,000 students. So one of the first things that I did when I started teaching there was doing community history and oral history. And the reason was twofold. One was that I had been a movement organizer in the 70s in the Deep South for about 6 years. And out of that experience, I learned a lot about grassroots community movements, and particularly in the African American community in the Deep South. Memphis, as you know, is where Dr. King was killed. I came there 2 years after he was killed. Worked with all kinds of people in the black community and the rest of the community, but the black community was really together and very strong, and this was, you could really learn from those people, and they were open to other people coming in and helping to organize. When I went on and cotton mill compresses and seed oil compresses, really horrible jobs, terrible heat, and had no rights to speak up until they organized the union. And so I started going around talking to people that I found through research into union newspapers. I found names of people. And I started out with the union officials who were mostly named, but then I would ask them, okay, your union was majority black, the officers are all white, so can you tell me somebody black in your error. I didn't have the advantage of somebody, yes, taking a class from Andrew that tells you how to do oral history. I just had to learn it through making a lot of mistakes on my own. And the mistakes would saying too much, interjecting yourself in the conversation when you're really trying to bring them, to tell their story, and often just trying to get at specific information. What you want is a life story. You want somebody to tell who they are, where they came from, their grandparents, and everything that they can tell you. That's a long interview, like 2 hours at least. And so if you can get a bunch of those interviews, you start to form the character of the whole community. And so the preface to the book is called The Power of Remembering, which is that a community, when brought together through oral history, starts to recognize itself as a community. And if you can then transpose the story is there, but it's not ever told. So oral history is about trying to get these sort of subterranean stories out in public. So anyway, when we started our campus, I didn't know very much about Tacoma, but it reminded me a lot of Memphis. It was about the same size of town. Part of town that we started was at the Perkins Building at 11th and A Street. Downtown was a real mess at that time. Where we have our campus now, between 17th and 19th on Pacific Avenue, was a red light district. They wanted to tear everything down. They were busily tearing down the downtown, getting rid of the buildings. And the University of Washington did this bold move in that old district and rebuilding the buildings. So the students are sitting on a gold, in my view, which is that they're in the middle of what used to be a Japanese-American community until the internment came along in World War II. They're sitting on Puyallup land, lands that are still part of the Puyallup legacy and heritage. They're sitting in areas that used to be Nordic and Italian and Germanic and various groups from Eastern and Southern Europe. And they're sitting next to the concentration of the black community. So this is the Tacoma Community History Project. 1991, when I first started teaching this, I've taught about the methods of oral history, and starting with that you also have to learn about this community history before you start interviewing people, so that you don't go in like as an ignorant person, that that you ask good questions and that you understand something about the community people come from. Can I pick this up? Okay. So it's organized in different ways. There's over 70 in this collection, and Justin Wildman will tell you. Method was trying to reach older people that we knew were going to pass away, and this was, a lot of these people haven't, thank God, but my own experience in doing oral history was I missed a couple of key interviews because I waited too long when the people died. And then most of the people I talked to were quite old, and like nobody ever asked me any of this before. Like even their children didn't know about some battles they had at the workplace. And so I became really kind of obsessed with finding the elders of a community to begin with, because those are the people that are the most and have these long, long memories. So let's see if I can go back. So we have business people, civic leaders, Bill Moss, civil rights activists in the so-called white community, the language school, ethnic communities can do a lot of different things. Let's see if there's something that's not over. The Greek community in Tacoma, Japanese Americans, of course, and Puyallup Native Americans, Mexican Americans, the Cambodian immigrant community, and Vietnamese. So, in other words, one of the things the students learn is that ethnic is not just about color, it's about language, it's about history, it's about religion, it's about a whole framework that somebody has. So if you're going to interview Slavic fishermen in Big Harbor, you need to understand something about Croatia, where people came from, and so forth. So it's been very rewarding because along with these oral histories, and you can find not all, but most of them are now transcribed, available on the website. And all you have to do is Google Tacoma Community History Project and it'll come up. So you have not only their interviews, but the students are also obliged to write a paper based on research. And that's another thing that I try to teach people, is that just because somebody remembers something, that does not history. That's what they remember. And they might remember it in different ways, you know, depending on circumstances. And so your job is to be the person who's trying to do the research to get the factual basis for the story, and then put the oral history into that context. So it's a writing challenge for students as well. But, you know, from the point of view of the community, I think that it's just a course that people can use, and we're going to teach it again this coming spring. I'm looking forward to cooperating with Andrew and his group of people. Will Burkhardt over there is going to do some of this with undergraduate students, and you know it's almost infinite when you start thinking about history this way. There's so much that can be done. So I think I'll turn it over to Justin Wadlin and let him talk about that, because he's been cooperating with the Tacoma Public Library and other people. And just bring one thing to your attention, I put some flyers out back there called Contested Spaces, Power and Resistance in the Pacific Northwest. This is the Pacific Northwest History Association meeting in October in Tacoma, Washington. So be alert for that. Okay, thank you.
Good evening, thanks Mike. Yeah, I have a presentation that I'm going to share tonight, and in the past I've often talked about all of the work that goes into behind the scenes supporting a project, and I am really quite proud and humbled by the fact that I've been entrusted to help out with this project. The library is holding these stories, and in fact I wanted to use this tonight to kind of think not just sort of like where we are and talk about Ben, but where this might be going, and kind of give a sense of my vision for that. I'm going to be a little bold here and kind of just throw some ideas out here. And so I basically am going to share with you my idea of what an oral history platform for the city might look like. And this is really kind of a speculative journey. I just was going to use my imagination here. And So I think one thing that I want to do before I get started is mention that this is really coming out of my experiences and perspectives of supporting these kinds of projects, but also seeing what other people are doing across the country, participating in national conferences of librarians and archivists and others who are supporting this kind of work. And there are two images that I want to share that will guide our speculative journey. I'm sure you recognize this. It's almost the vantage of from where we are. It's just one street up. And I took this on one of those crisp October mornings that we've been having. The kid was coming into work early enough that the sun was coming up. And I show the mountain off in the distance because, just to remind you all, our city is named after it. And, or sort of the sort of Anglo approximation of the Shootsy word for it, which I have not yet learned, but it's one of the things I want to do. And I've lived within sight of the mountain for 20 years and been looking at it from this vantage for about 15 years and started working at Tacoma. And the presence of that summit off in the distance has influenced me a little bit, and I'm thinking about. And I also just kind of like to riff a little bit on what both of our speakers have. Just think about this landscape and all the stories that it holds, all the stories that are happening with it. And how do we make those visible? How do we share them? How do people access them? That's wisdom, that's pain, there's a lot of stuff there. So this image is this picture of this plan that was created by an architect named Etienne Louis Boyle in the 18th century, and this was his design for the National Library of France, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And he imagined this reading room, and at the time this was kind of an innovative idea, but he pictured having all of human knowledge in one room. So you walk in there and you can see like the vastness of it. And I think it's telling that this was never built. Though Boyle claims that's what they're doing. It is kind of a utopian vision of the library. But it is very influential. It influenced the design rooms that later developed in London and Europe, the United States. You can see sort of this in even the Library of Congress reading room. So what I'm going to share tonight is this kind of speculative utopian vision of what things might look like. And it's a little bit influenced by this idea of kind of doing something big and bold and comprehensive. So I just decided to draw this because I didn't want to make it look too fancy as if it was real. And of course we'll start with a search box because we're all accustomed to having a search box. And of course the search box is going to search oral histories, but there are some real challenges to oral histories in terms of access and searching them. I could see that it would perhaps allow some way of kind of searches to interviews, organizations, neighborhoods, communities, identities, themes, and subjects. I think one of the things that I just note from sort of a library is that oral histories are really complex objects for us to handle because you have a recording, which is and a transcript. And so let's have to linking those in some way. There are some tools out there that are starting to do that effectively. Kind of lost track of my notes. So anyhow, we've got the search box. But I think the main thing that I would emphasize is that I'd want to have this be interactive. And a lot of like the oral history project that we've created is really designed for the dedicated research who's really going to dig into this. And I imagine community members might find it of interest, but it's not really designed for sort of casual browsing or the sort of ordinary interest. So we would have some featured projects, and this maybe, if depending on how much staffing there was behind it, could have sort of running clips that are shared. You sort of talk about projects, oral histories, things like that, and it would be a rotating slider that sort of grabs people's attention, perhaps tied to a blog. But then, of course, I would want to have some different pathways for navigating that. You see some of this on our Tacoma Community History Project page where we do have a map, but it doesn't really quite function in the way that I would want it. I would actually, dreaming big, I would want to have the map correspond to the interview transcripts and like talking about a neighborhood or something like that. I think also one thing, as you kind of heard, there's just this bubbling of interest in oral histories among faculty and even in the community, and I would want this to be able to accommodate multiple projects, so that it's like you have the Tacoma Community History Project, you also have the project that Andrew Gomez is working on, and be able to search across those would be amazing, because there are stories that might complement each other, and there are other projects that I'm aware of that might be there. And then of course communities, and by communities it's sort of broadly defined. It could be organizations, it could be neighborhoods, any number of things. So, let's see that. But I think the important thing that I want to emphasize is the engagement, and like thinking about this not just purely as a discovery tool, but as it actually is kind of a way to have people contribute to it and participate in it. This would be kind of a complicated undertaking, and in fact, there's I'm sort of learning about the participatory design process. I would actually want to. This is me just throwing some ideas on a page. I would want to engage in the participatory design process, perhaps with different communities that might use it. What would it look like for a school teacher to use these oral histories? What kind of things do they need, curricula and so on? What would it look like for university professors who want to have a class that contributes to it? Maybe they just want to do oral histories, or do they have a project that they want to do? What does it look like for a community organization that wants to do an oral history of itself? Maybe they have the time and the resources and the interest. Could they be paired with students or professor to do that? And what about researchers who might take the data of these oral histories and do analysis on it? So sort of thinking forward in terms of using the transcripts. I think one really interesting example of that is this oral history that was done at a Japanese language school on our campus. And there was a urban studies student who used the transcripts to create a detailed map of Japantown based on the geographic data that people shared in those interviews. So there are all these kinds of interesting questions that can be answered by this material. This is my kind of corny name for it, Grit Story. I want it to be short and catchy and sort of, kind of capture Tacoma and I realize my handwriting is a little messy there. I basically did this with my smartphone and my kids' markers at home with a like little kind of copy stand. So I'll just sort of say what those are. And you can see these are kind of what would standard be on these kind of websites. But I think the most important thing that I would emphasize is the partners. Like right now, most of these projects emerge out of an institution. Tacoma is small enough that I can sort of have the dream of like, what if we started working together? and then I think, oh wait, I got this thing that I've got to deal with, and here. So I think that's just I would love to see more conversations around how we might partner on a project, something like this. And just to show you what it might look like if you landed on a page of this, it looks a lot like what Mike was showing. But I think a couple things that I would sort of, in my little brainstorm that I had here, that I point out, tags. I do think one of the ways that we describe these objects is as the library, as catalogers, professionals. What would it look like to have the community come in and do describe, how would they describe these interviews? What are the things of note? I think we'd have to be careful about opening that up, because sometimes there are things that could happen in terms of other people coming in, maybe maliciously putting in the wrong kinds of things that we might not want there, but I think that would be one. And then also, to what extent can other files be pulled into this that might be like digitized files from other kinds of collections, images, things like that. So, how far are we from having a platform like this in Tacoma? And I thought I would actually use this nice watershed map of the Puyallup River. And so I'm going to place, okay, here, this is this platform. That's like, how far are we? And so, let's see, I would say, like, for those of you who know local geography, sort of, where would you place us? Are we in the park, in the national park? Are we in Greenwater? Or Buckley? Ording? I'm moving farther and farther away from the mountain, you can tell. Okay, anybody want to guess? Hazard a guess? We are in Tacoma, right here where we stand. You know, I think if I was presenting to a library audience, I would really get into some of the details of like, what are those things that actually stand in the way? Why? And they basically boil down to 3 categories. You know, and I think again, I just remind us, I guess, the view is beautiful from here. So you know, we've been able to do some amazing work. But I would boil those sort of 3 categories down to sort of the technical limitations. Resources, I mean, this would be a huge amount of work, and you know, most of us are limited around that. Where would the funds go? We tend to be allocated funds from different sources, and we all have to be careful about that. But then also there's a sort of organizational, cultural aspect. We're not used to working in this way necessarily, or we have our typical partners that we work with. How do we build those bridges? But I guess you know, I would just like to end on a positive note and talk about how we might get there. What are some just kind of like, what's achievable? And I also would say, this is based on the assumption that we do want to go there. I think somebody could challenge me on this idea of like, is it worthwhile to have this kind of comprehensive collection? I think Mike beautifully talked about how this kind of history is a people's history. It is not a official history. And so that image of the library, the big room where all the knowledge is, that comes out of a particular cultural context of dominance, colonialism, power. To what extent do we want to have that in the collections that we actually are creating? So that's just, it's worth questioning that. This is not a reason not to do it, but I am going to just say, that's another separate presentation. I'll just say, let's assume this is a good idea. It will benefit people because I do think there is a real value in sharing this when people do want their stories shared. So these are just, I have like 2, just very simple ones. From the short term, I think this to me is about people's time rather than having any specific funding. One would be some kind of a citywide oral history alliance that just improves communication and coordination of projects. We're just talking about what we're doing. We're doing that tonight, so that's partly why I was like, I'm going to just put this out there to this group because I think there are some people here who might care about that. Longer term, I think looking at collaborating on grants that would create this citywide oral history program, maybe taking pieces of it. I do think there are national grants that I actually think this would be something that could be of national interest to create a model because we are this mid-sized city. How many other mid-sized cities are like this where you can kind of dream of having all of the libraries, archives, and cultural institutions collaborating around some kind of citywide project? And I do know all the universities here are really promoting and prioritizing community engagement, and this seems like one way that like the universities can really give back to the community to make sure that we are good stewards of this history that's being shared with us. So I realize that I'm presenting mostly to the side, I'm sorry. And I'll just end there. Thank you.
Sure, yeah.
Just Q&A, I guess. Oh, yeah. So, anybody has any questions about anything that we talked about? Yeah.
I have a comment, actually. So maybe I'll come up here. A good example of what Justin was just talking about.
Can you use the microphone, please?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
A good example of why this kind of community-wide platform would be good. A couple of years ago, the Slavic Croatian community asked me to be a consultant on an oral history project, and they were trying to get the long story that they could about people who were fishermen and people who came from Croatia. And so I tried to teach them about the methods of doing oral history, and then they just went off and did it. A whole bunch of different people doing it. And so I wasn't in the position of trying to monitor the quality of what they did, and I really don't know too much of the quality. But their vision of doing this was to then bring everybody together a big thing at the Slavonian Hall. It was a great afternoon. I mean, they had Slavonian music, they had Slavonian food. We had a great time. And then I think, I wonder where all those oral histories went. You know, and I'm always thinking, and people die, and I'm also a labor historian, and one of the things that happens with labor records is they disappear. So you don't know really what happened. So the Heritage Center in Seattle got funding from the state legislature to start a labor archive, and they went out aggressively, and they're getting papers from different unions that have collapsed or whatever. So I think this kind of thing that Justin's talking about and the initiative that Andrew's taking and the thing that we've been doing at UWT needs to be hooked up with the Tacoma Historical Society and other groups, kind of like what he's suggesting, and certainly the library. Because I've seen this happen many times, where people get interviewed and this great thing, and then nobody knows what went. And then I have one other question for both of you. The Heritage Center for Oral History has posted all these interviews that students have done, but they're posted as videos. And so there is no transcript. There's a little summary for each one. And I've always thought that's kind of not enough. On the other hand, it's more exciting than what we have, which is, you know, you have to go in there and really search and read the transcripts. So this goes to the medium, you know, that we're using. So we're probably all facing that issue.
So I would say briefly about that. It's really interesting. So I created this digital history project one time with a group of students of mine on the expulsion, the Chinese expulsion in 1885. It's called the Tacoma Method, tacomamethod.com. And one of the things that's really fascinating is looking at the analytics of how people use the site. And you realize very quickly how short people's attention span is. And most users, for instance, on the site, a slight majority are mobile users. And so there are all of these little things you glean from looking at the analytics of the site where you realize how people use them. And so I totally get this. I think that's all the time. Like as a historian, what I would want at an oral history site, and then what makes it usable to somebody who's trying to quickly get something. And I think that's an endless negotiation. And to that point about that website that Jim Gregory founded, which is an incredible repository, there are all types of challenges for that too. I remember when the videos first went up for that site, the files were real media files, which most of you know. And so there's also just that, like who do you have to pay every few years to like change the format of whatever video or audio you're using? So like the dedicated labor that goes into it. So even that's been hard. That's UW Seattle, right? Like they have some resources. And so there are all sorts of challenges, and yeah, those are things that I think about all the time.
Could I speak to that? Yeah, I guess what I've read about the sort of expectation around oral histories is that without a transcript, the oral history, it really reduces the accessibility of it. But video is a compelling medium. I just wanted to introduce Joan Hua here. Sorry to put you on the spot. She is working with me on a Founding Stories Oral History project where we're doing an oral history about the founding and development of UW Tacoma. We decided to do only audio recordings because even though we're sort of losing the visual engagement of a video, there are significant costs that come with using a video. So to get a good image, for instance, you have to have some good lighting. You have to know how to take it. You have to have a camera. You have to have equipment. It creates a really big file. And then also, if you're interviewing people who are not used to speaking in public, having a camera right in your face and asking about really intimate things can be off-putting. We are sort of opting for getting the best quality audio files that we can using high-quality equipment with lavalier mics. So that's kind of the decision that we've made. But for any kind of project, I think it's a matter of like what resources you have. And I do think with the video files, the format is a really big challenge that in migrating it as things update I guess that's what I would say about that.
Add something on that, kind of uniting, I think, a couple of the things is with the audio files, if you're thinking about how people are going to use it, and there are so many mobile users, that it's really easy to pull up an audio file and leave it running on your iPhone or your Android or whatever as you're doing whatever else it is you're doing. So again, if you're looking at that kind of use, the metric and kind of use cases, whereas a video you have to dedicate your eyeballs to it, right? So, which is not to say people don't do that. Video use on phones, especially with the younger generations, is skyrocketing, but it's just, it has that broader kind of swath. There's something else I was going to say, and I forgot.
So your comments, it kind of reminded me too of like one of the ways that we're working with this rapidly evolving digital world that we live in is, so we are going to use the same platform, Content Beyond is what is sort of the technology that's behind it for those who care about those kind of things, to create this collection. And the full interview is going to be on, much like the Tacoma Community History Project. But we are also using SoundCloud to create clips, and then in SoundCloud you can have a picture of the interviewees. So that then creates sort of a visual draw. So, so you might see a picture of yourself with an audio clip, because you were interviewed.
So I've worked on some oral history projects in Boyle Heights and in Lewis County. They're very small projects, but what I found was good for audiences. For me as a historian, I took the history, I took down the interview, and then for the audience, what I did was combine it with something visual, so like a photo or a small video, and then just put a few captions of the oral history that kind of told the story. And in Lewis County, they sold that as a book of history of Lewis County, and people really connected to seeing parts of their story published. Because it's true that people are not going to sit and watch, a 2-hour video or read a full transcript unless you're a historian, unless you're really invested. But I think people are interested in the information, so just being able to put those snippets together with something that's visually captivating, a photo or small video, I think it's a good way to reach audiences.
I'm wondering if how are you doing like content analysis of all of these oral histories so that you can make these clustered things? I mean, is there any technology that has emerged that lets you go into interviews that you've got on tape now that will pull out stuff on, let's say, if they're talking about places or if they're talking about periods with political this and that, how do you retrieve bits without some sort of content analysis program? I was just curious.
How do you build that search engine he's talking about?
Yeah, I mean, do you have a way in the library? For example, I remember I was living here in the 70s, and there was a lot of oral interviewing done for the bicentennial, right, and all of those. And I often wondered what happened to all of those, and can anybody go in there and pull out pieces of that in order to do some of these, smaller projects?
Joan, do you have any insights into that?
Anybody knows? Yeah.
Do you want to take that one? I mean, I could sort of throw out a few things, but I don't want to put you on the spot here.
Our fourth panel.
Because she's doing a lot of this work, and I will say that the search interface is pretty rudimentary for what we have, but then you can come in and sort of...
Yeah, I'd love to know, just,
Yeah.
Thanks for asking that. So it's not magical that when we create a record for oral history, we're not like running through some program and then it does that. But we have the practice of archiving and cataloging. So there's metadata for the object, which is like the top level is the interviewee and this package, and then you have the audio, and so there's administrative metadata for the formats and stuff like that, and then there are keywords, and then it kind of depends on the collection. So for the collection that the Founding Stories one, I write the description, so there's like full sentences, and then there are subject headings, there are controlled headings from Library of Congress. So those are some ways to organize that, and then I think in other collections I've seen some would use the metadata or the transcript as data and like further analyze it, so surface like repeating terms or things like that, and then it's a matter of how you display that. And so it's not just once you find it, one piece of one interview, how do you figure out what it's about? But it's when you look at a whole collection, how do you know where to go without knowing the names of the interviewees? What themes are coming out in this collection? So that becomes interesting when you're using like transcripts as data, and you can do some analysis of that. And then historians do that in other ways too. So I think it depends on the collection, but because we're archiving it, there's like a set process for creating descriptive metadata for each.
And it's like subject, I mean, would be topical. I mean, topical, big categories, like community aspects or whatever would be. I mean, I'm trying to think, how do you choose the content keywords that you want to use?
So
Yeah.
just to make it very specific,
Yeah.
remember that Mike was looking at the Tacoma Community History Project and selecting the different communities, African Americans.
Right.
Those are all terms that have to be assigned by
Right.
somebody. So
Right.
somebody has to look at this and say, okay, this is an interview with an African American person. So that is a bit of what Joan is kind of talking about, is that description of that.
Pretty high level.
In terms of the content analysis, and that's, I've only just recently came across a platform that was specifically designed for providing access to oral histories, and it's called Aviary. If there are people out there that are sort of library information people interested in looking at that. We haven't really even started using it or testing it, so it's just part of the subscription and stuff like that.
Yeah.
One of my students early on, after maybe 5 years of the Tacoma Oral History Project, created an index, and it's a really thick book. And he went through all of the interviews and did just like what you would do in the back of a book with an index. So under Harold Moss, there's, police riot, urban league, things like that. And then under Lyle Quasim, you'd find some of those same things. And then you'd find another heading that just says police riots, and you'd find Lyle Quasim.
Cross.
Find Harold Moss.
That's it. Yeah.
But that took him a whole term to do it, and it was all just on paper. So there's got to be a better way. And the fact that these things are now digitized, I think raises the possibility that things that are digitized, that are transcripts, could be we could create a really good research format.
But what about meshing social media and GIS, like story maps? I've seen that. I mean,
Yeah, I have no idea about that.
So there are some pretty good examples of that, right? So history can, for instance, is like a really interesting participatory project where I guess we have a map of the world, and if you have images or stories about a particular place, you can pick a pin and develop a collection. So you can go to history pages.
and it's free.
Yeah, it's free. And there are some quirks to it that I have issues with. But yeah, that is a great idea. Like, how do you meet people where they are so that they can feel empowered to upload their own stuff, so it's not just us going to communities and extracting stuff, which carries all sorts of other problems. And so yeah, there are some of those models that I think are really interesting. But
Arches, in the Getty.
yeah, but sometimes the way that some of those sites are funded is a little, and it's often funded by private money from investors and so on. That can be weird what you do with people's data. So when you're trying to tell people, yes, give us your stories, it's like, okay, but when you're doing these stories, so that's one of the complicated things.
I wanted to ask about the opportunities to use this, create these great archives that are being created
it's complicated, and even just looking at this project, it looks completely different for those three communities. So for instance, the work I've done with Trans Reconciliation Park, for them it's really helpful. And they've been able to use it in their fundraising materials and things like that. That website that I mentioned, that gets used to train docents every year for the Tacoma Moon Festival. So that makes a project, it makes it actionable so that it's usable to people. The broader sort of question you're getting there at, like policy decision and those sorts of things, that's tougher. How do you make it that important? Where do you place it in such a way where it's that compelling you're saying this is going to change the nature of decision making? I think one of the biggest things we can do is just make it visible. So for instance, one of the things that I've mentioned as a possibility that we've been talking about with the Hilltop Action Coalition is that they have like this bi-monthly publication. And we're talking about the possibility of taking some of the interviews and editing them down into like little articles, like little community histories. So that the publication is not just what's going on, but like where has this place been? And so I think one thing that could be helpful is just normalizing the presence of talking about these issues and getting this discussion going between what happened in the past and what is going on in the present are deeply linked. But that question of how do you make it actionable at the policy level, that's something that is pretty tough to do.
So we were doing that with the National Trust, actually. I'm not on the panel, but I'm just talking. We did that with the National Trust when we worked in Boyle Heights, and we were collecting oral history on the Latino community there to build an argument for the significance of that community and why it should be preserved. And it helps a lot when there's not a lot of documented written history. Immigrant communities, a lot of times it's not documented history, so in that way it did help foreign policy.
Well, I think there's kind of two answers to that question. When I was preparing for this, I googled on an organization that is actually, I can't remember what it was called, but it is basically training people to do oral histories for social justice. So one model is actually doing oral history from the standpoint of actually trying to make some kind of policy change. So that the oral history is doing a particular goal, it's not just purely documenting. The other, I think, if you are taking more of a historical approach of creating a collection or archival collection, the way I think about it is like what we're doing in the library is creating a primary source. The primary sources are like the raw material, and so it's not always like it's like the oatmeal that hasn't been cooked. It's just there, kind of waiting to be used in some other purpose. And so, but I do think it's on libraries and people who work with these collections to sort of, the way I think about like what we're doing with the SoundCloud clips blog is to create hooks for like the people who are actually influencing policy, who are trying to answer a particular question. They start Googling, they find an oral history or mentioned on a blog, and that drives them into these collections. So I think that's one of the things how I could see it happening, but it's the sort of linkage is, often people are doing this sort of creative work of trying to make change, might not necessarily immediately know about it unless they start searching for this.
So, I was just wondering, does the Tacoma Library, I mean, do you guys that are teaching at the college just feed your stuff into the Tacoma Library about Tacoma? I mean, does the library want oral histories that have been done in other contexts? Are you kind of a...
No, we're not working.
You're not doing that?
No.
Yeah.
That was about something else. But I mean, I do, like most of it, like work that I've done with the public library, I've been about other projects, but it's not specifically about the ones.
Yeah, I've taught here for a lot of years. I used to send material to the Northwest Room, for example.
Yeah.
And, we're working with guys in the Northwest Room and would feed stuff in. It just seems like such a logical place to feed that we wonder. Yeah.
This is something the Tacoma Historical Society could do more than probably anybody else. Try to find a way to cross these different projects. And make it known, like this thing about policy, for instance. I had a student who was a teacher in public schools and at Jason Lee, and she was interested in desegregation of the schools in the 60s and 70s when that was happening with the courts. And so she did a long interview with Willie Stewart, who was a real, leader, African American leader in the school system. But then she also did a huge amount of policy research as part of her interviewing him. And she interviewed the guy who actually constructed the whole desegregation process in Tacoma. So it's sitting there, somebody who's a teacher did a really good job.
Where is it?
And it would be a policy thing, somebody who's working on schools now and segregation now, but do they know it's there?
Where is it? Yeah.
So that is part of the thing, is how do we get these stories out there and get them known?
And also have a repository where people would actually, instead of having to go find the woman that did the interview, you've got to.
Well, in this case, they can go right to our website and find it, but they don't know it's there.
They don't know it's there.
We will post the link.
I don't need it, I've been on stage in a very loud voice. I hope we find a way to do this, and one of the reasons is that I think our young people have this is an opportunity for them to begin to understand from the grassroots how many people from how many different areas of the world ended up in the place that they're growing up. Because of some work I did a few years ago, I learned that the territory, we were not a state until 1889, but between 1880 and 1890, the territory of Washington grew by 2,000%. Now, I don't know the statistics anyplace else, but also the people that were coming, there were not that many Puyallup Indians having babies. It did not grow because of that. It grew because of the people coming here. And they came here not just from Europe, they came from Asia, they came from everywhere because there were resources here. Fresh water, salt water, logging, mining. There were so many things, and many things yet to be discovered. But if they were farmers, they could do that as well. And so, to appreciate, I remember when I came here to work for Russell, I didn't know where Tacoma was when the guy called me and said, "Hey, well, the answer is south of Seattle." Okay. Oh, I said, okay. And now that having lived here, none of us want to be described, and we shouldn't be, as just being south of Seattle. This is an incredible place, and learning more when you're younger about the place you grew up and why it is what it is, and oral discussion, we're talking about civil conversations these days, and I think these oral histories are the beginning, and they represent civil conversations.
If I could piggyback on what you just said, Nan is our an incoming board member for the Tacoma Historical Society, so we're very happy to have her join the board. But speaking as the managing director for the Tacoma Historical Society, I'm really happy to hear what your perspective about the potential role that the Historical Society can play in a project like this. I think we'd be very interested. For some years we've been quite under-resourced, unlike cities that are actually smaller than Tacoma. Those historical societies get quite a bit of funding from their cities, and in the case of Tacoma, we don't get any city support. But there is good news, however, in the incoming funding coming from the Tacoma Creates initiative that stands to bring new resources to heritage and arts and culture in our community. But it's especially that funding for heritage piece that we really hope to be able to take advantage of that and develop new programming, new outreach efforts in the community, and something like what Justin's describing here is very exciting, and I think we'd be quite interested in working closely with you on that, as well as the Historic Preservation Office and nonprofits like Historic Tacoma as well. So thank you for this presentation this evening.
Such a good discussion, and unfortunately, I have to end it because they have another event coming in. So I also wanted to add that the City of Tacoma does have the Heritage Project Grant. That application period is now open, so you can go to cityoftacoma.org/historic preservation, and we provide funding for heritage projects, and I think all the stuff that we've been talking about now would be a great grant application, especially if we can get some of these organizations to work together. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to our sponsors, and thank you to our speakers. Really great, and I think hopefully we can continue this conversation because I think there's a lot of interest there. Thank you.
I know, but still, it was gonna yeah. No, I know, but still, I was like, this might take a while. Did you play a role when the Tacoma campus started? Mind if I bug you about this at some point? I'd like to hear about it.
Yeah, no, it's fun. You're so, and I taught up on Untitled for years.
So as part of this project, we're going to try and interview Maxine in the spring.
Yeah, so that's good.
But I was trying to figure out precisely this. Who are the other early faculty?
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, so, but great that you're here.
Likewise. Pleasure to meet you.
Oh, it's great. Because, and, yeah, we're up in Hilltop in Alberta together and all that stuff that's going on.
Because it's an amazing story. The Tacoma campus.
Well,